They said the house still breathed beneath the snow, that if you stood long enough at the edge of the elm grove, you could hear it, a low, rhythmic sound like lungs pulling in the cold air of a forgotten century. But that wasn't the house breathing. That was the soil remembering. Because beneath those floorboards, 17 bodies slept in pieces, their throats cut with surgical precision, their hands bound in knots that no sailor or priest could explain. And when the magistrates pried up those planks in the winter of 1697, they found something else. A symbol, burned into the underside of the wood. A circle divided by 3 perfect lines, a mark so old that even the Puritan scholars refused to name it. They sealed the house before dusk. They burned the records before dawn. And they erased one name from the history of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the name Prudence Fairweather. The woman they called the Puritan surgeon. The one who healed by day and hunted by candlelight. No textbooks speak of her. No sermons warn of her kind. But if you dig into the hidden archives of Harvard's first medical faculty, there's a single surviving note written in the margin of a confiscated autopsy report. She believed the flesh could be purified through pain. That phrase, purified through pain, would echo through secret orders, disappear into hidden hospitals, and surface again centuries later in government experiments on spiritual endurance. Because Prudence Fairweather wasn't just a murderer. She was a prototype for every system that came after her: the state, the church, the institutions that claim to heal while they quietly dissect the human soul. Tonight, I'm not here to tell you a ghost story. I'm here to show you the birth of a mechanism, one that began with a woman in a spotless cap and cold hands, and evolved into the psychological machinery that still governs obedience today. You were never meant to know this name. You were never meant to hear her story. But now that you have, you're already part of it. To understand Prudence Fairweather, you must first understand the sickness that gave her permission to exist. Salem Village, 1692, a wound still raw from its own hysteria. The witch trials had burned their way through the colony like fever through a child. The people were starving for purity, and starving men will eat poison if it's served as righteousness. Into that wound walked Prudence, a widow, alone, carrying a wagon lined with surgical steel and scripture. She presented herself as a healer, a student of both anatomy and theology, a strange combination, even for her time. The villagers welcomed her cautiously. They needed her, and need is the first gate of control. They say she came from Providence, but Providence never claimed her. Every document she showed was forged, the signatures, the seals, even the wax. Yet the forgery was not clumsy. It was beautiful. It was the kind of lie that only a mind fluent in structure could build. Her instruments, knives, saws, forceps, glimmered like relics, polished with ritualistic care. And every night, she lit her candles with deliberate precision. 3 on the hearth, 1 near the window, always burning until dawn. Neighbors called her pious, compassionate, gifted with the Lord's grace in the healing arts. But the devout are often the most dangerous, because when someone believes they are chosen to cleanse, mercy becomes irrelevant. By autumn, Prudence was tending to births, wounds, and illnesses no one else would touch. Yet every patient left her house feeling both comforted and unsettled. Her touch was calm, too calm. Her hands were steady even when death was near. Some said she prayed over the sick. Others said she whispered to them. But the dying often spoke her name with a kind of awe, as if she'd shown them something beyond. And the whispers began, that she could draw out sickness through the blood, that she knew the weight of a soul by the warmth of its flesh, that she could tell before a man died whether his sins would make the body decay faster. But the strangest thing wasn't what she did to her patients. It was what she kept from them: their blood, their hair, their teeth, each cataloged and preserved in jars marked with verses from the book of Leviticus. Prudence didn't see herself as a murderer. She saw herself as an instrument, a surgeon for God's secret anatomy. And in the heart of a broken colony, desperate, paranoid, consumed by the idea of sin that made her unstoppable, Prudence Fairweather's first disappearance was quiet. Too quiet. On February 14, 1693, Margaret Kennan, a widow revered for her piety, failed to return from evening prayers. No one noticed at first Salem Village was accustomed to harsh winters, lost travelers, and sudden deaths. But by morning, the church pews held empty spaces where her presence had always been certain, and a cold dread began to settle in. By that evening, the whispers had begun. Mothers clutched their children closer. Farmers lingered near their homes. And Prudence, in her spotless cap and steady hands, offered solace. She prayed for Margaret. She assured the villagers that the Lord had taken her to a better place, that no sin had caused this tragedy. And the people, desperate for explanation, accepted her words without question. It would take months before the truth clawed its way into the light. Bodies buried beneath floorboards, each marked with the same meticulous care: the precise cuts, the bound hands, the ritualistic symbols burned or carved into the skin. And always, Prudence's instruments nearby, polished and waiting. What is most terrifying about Prudence wasn't that she killed. It was the elegance of her method. She understood human psychology as well as anatomy. She created a theater of normalcy, a stage where her victims vanished while the audience, the village, applauded her piety. Fear became invisible under her cultivated charm. The community trusted her. They needed to trust her. And in that trust, she found freedom. She learned to manipulate the grid of social control without ever raising suspicion. She prayed publicly, spoke eloquently of divine mercy, and offered her services to the sick. In private, she cataloged her work notes on flesh, bone, and spirit. Each body became a study, each ritual a lesson in control. The tools of life and death in her hands were indistinguishable. And while the villagers were distracted by sermons, snowstorms, and the lingering ghosts of the witch trials, Prudence transformed her home into a laboratory for understanding the limits of obedience, faith, and fear. She tested how far devotion could be pushed, how deeply trust could be weaponized. The chilling truth is that she wasn't constrained by morality. She was constrained only by curiosity and opportunity, and in the shadow of a society addicted to judgment and purification, she had both in abundance. Every body she claimed was not merely a victim. It was a message, a map of human compliance, a hidden blueprint for anyone who understood the architecture of control and the terrifying potential it held. Prudence's genius lay not in brute violence, but in the cultivation of absolute authority. She understood something most people never fully grasp: that fear can be hidden behind the guise of care, and devotion can be extracted through subtle manipulation. She was the perfect predator in a village terrified of sin, disease, and the unseen forces that stalked the edges of their world. Her medical knowledge gave her credibility, her devotion gave her cover, and her demeanor, calm and deliberate, masked an intelligence honed to precise cruelty. Villagers who approached her felt both relief and unease, a dissonance she nurtured like a sacred ritual. She observed them, their reactions to sickness, to death, to the unknown, and cataloged their weaknesses with a precision no one else could rival. She was learning not just anatomy but psychology. She was mapping obedience. Even the most skeptical settlers found themselves confiding in her. Husbands, widows, children, all unknowingly revealing patterns of trust, belief, and fear. Prudence took note. Every whispered prayer, every tearful confession, every hesitant touch became data. She constructed an invisible network of influence within the village, a lattice of human behavior that allowed her to predict and control outcomes with uncanny accuracy. And while the villagers marveled at her skill, they failed to see the deeper currents flowing beneath her words and deeds. She wasn't merely healing. She was testing thresholds. She was identifying the breaking points of conscience. Every illness treated, every body repaired, every comforting word spoken was a brushstroke in a larger design, a design that few could recognize until it was too late. The ritualistic nature of her murders was more than devotion to some imagined theology. It was experimentation, a controlled study of the interplay between fear, trust, and moral submission. She cataloged reactions to terror, responses to pain, and the malleability of human belief. Prudence Fairweather understood that true power did not lie in killing alone. It lay in the creation of dependency, the orchestration of obedience, and the subtle shaping of perception. By the time anyone suspected her, she had already vanished from their immediate grasp. The marks of her work were hidden beneath floorboards, in jars of preserved organs, and in the memories of those she manipulated. The fear she left behind was intangible, yet profound, a dark echo embedded into the very psyche of Salem Village. And in that echo, the first lesson emerges for those who dare to listen. Authority is most dangerous when it wears the face of benevolence. Prudence Fairweather's house was deceptively simple. A modest wooden structure on the outskirts of Salem Village, surrounded by ancient elms whose bare limbs formed a natural screen. But inside, it was a theater of precision, a controlled environment where life, death, and obedience could be observed, manipulated, and cataloged. Each corner had purpose. Each tool was meticulously placed, and each candle, flickering against the dark walls, cast shadows she used to study movement, reaction, and fear. Her patients entered seeking salvation from illness. They left unknowingly, marked by her observation. The sick, the injured, the desperate all became instruments in her study of human vulnerability. Prudence recorded their vital signs, their confessions, their pain thresholds. Every detail mattered. Every response was a variable in her unfolding experiment. The villagers never suspected the horror beneath their feet. The floorboards held a secret they would never voluntarily uncover. Beneath them, bodies were arranged with ritualistic exactitude, hands bound, throats cleanly severed, symbols etched onto flesh with a precision that implied knowledge beyond simple anatomy. These symbols were not mere decoration. They were markers, a language only Prudence could read, a system of codified insight into sin, fear, and submission. She moved through the village like a ghost, invisible yet ever-present. Her calm composure and rigorous adherence to piety kept suspicion at bay. She attended every service, listened to every confession, and offered counsel to the grieving. Her integration into the community was flawless, and as the villagers sought guidance, she gathered power, the quiet, inexorable authority of someone who knows both the human body and human fear. Prudence understood an unspoken truth. Power often resides in the unseen. She manipulated what others could not perceive, the invisible architecture of influence. One misplaced word, one hint of judgment, a subtle suggestion of divine favor, and entire families bent unknowingly to her will. She was rewriting the social order in her image, one whispered prayer and one carefully administered herb at a time. By the time any suspicion could take root, Prudence had already claimed her next subject. The cycle of disappearance, control, and observation continued uninterrupted. And the deeper she sank into this work, the more she understood the ultimate lesson. Fear can be taught, faith can be weaponized, and obedience, once engineered, can outlast the life of even its architect. Prudence Fairweather didn't simply kill. She orchestrated transformation. Her victims were not lost to chaos. They were carefully selected, studied, and then removed in ways that taught the living lessons they weren't aware they were learning. The village began to shift subtly, a psychological reshaping that left everyone complicit without knowing it. Families whispered behind closed doors, eyes darted to shadows, and prayers became increasingly desperate, not for salvation, but for permission to exist within the invisible framework she was constructing. Her understanding of anatomy was only the beginning. She knew how fear altered perception, how guilt could twist the mind into obedience, how grief could make a community pliable. Each murder, each ritual was calculated, and with every disappearance, she tested not only the physical limits of the body but the psychological limits of an entire population. The villagers, still reeling from the witch trials, were unknowingly participating in her experiment. And Prudence never rushed. Timing was critical. She struck when the winter storms isolated the village, when families were distracted by survival, when the authority of the church or the magistrates was stretched thin. She understood the rhythms of her environment as keenly as she understood the rhythms of the human body. Every decision, every movement, was a precise calculation, a symphony of control orchestrated by one mind. By midwinter, rumors had begun to circulate. Some spoke of lights in her windows at odd hours, shadows moving where no one should have been, and faint cries carried by the wind. But the villagers feared acknowledgement more than inquiry. Fear, Prudence understood, was most effective when invisible, unspoken, and accepted as part of the natural order. It was also at this point that her methods began to evolve. She wasn't just studying fear. She was engineering obedience. A slight suggestion here, a gentle correction there. A word whispered in confession, and entire families bent their beliefs subtly to mirror hers. She had discovered the secret that would echo through history. True power doesn't come from brute force. It comes from shaping perception, controlling the narrative, and ensuring that those under your gaze willingly carry the chains you crafted. And for Prudence Fairweather, the village itself became her laboratory. Every glance, every prayer, every whispered suspicion, all were data points, feeding a mind that had no moral compass but a limitless appetite for understanding human submission. By the spring of 1693, Prudence Fairweather had become more than a healer. She was a silent authority, a presence that defined reality in Salem Village without ever raising her voice. The people trusted her because they had no choice. She had woven herself into the very fabric of their survival. Food, medicine, counsel, and comfort all flowed through her hands. And through those hands, she quietly measured, tested, and recorded the limits of human compliance. The disappearances continued, each more precise, more ritualistic, and more symbolically encoded than the last. Yet no one accused her. How could they? She was the embodiment of their faith and reason. To question her was to question God and the fragile order of their lives. And in this calculated obedience, Prudence found the ultimate power, the ability to operate above suspicion while exercising absolute control. She began to manipulate the village not just physically, but spiritually. Sermons were subtly critiqued, rituals observed in precise order, prayers whispered with intentional cadence. People began to adopt her mannerisms, repeat her phrases, and internalize her judgments. She had learned that authority could be projected through example as easily as through direct command. And when authority is internalized, it becomes invisible, almost divine. Her house became a fortress of secrets. Inside, jars of organs, preserved hair, and blood-stained instruments lay organized with meticulous care. Symbols, etched and burned into wood and bone, created a language of dominion only she could understand. Each artifact was a study in obedience, a record of the human soul under controlled terror. Every night, she documented reactions, studied patterns, and planned her next move with surgical precision. And yet, she understood the ultimate paradox of power. It must appear effortless. The more calculated the control, the more it must masquerade as natural, as benevolent. Prudence had perfected this. Her calm, nurturing exterior masked a mind that dissected morality, trust, and fear with unflinching curiosity. Those who entered her home felt comfort, but left subtly altered their sense of judgment, their perception of safety, and their belief in authority quietly reshaped. By now, the villagers were walking through a web they could not see, their fates entwined with hers. Every disappearance, every ritual, every whispered warning was a thread in a tapestry they believed was woven by God, not by Prudence Fairweather. And in this web, she held the power to define reality itself. By midsummer, Prudence Fairweather had perfected a system so subtle that it became invisible to those it controlled. She no longer needed to act overtly. Authority, once internalized by the villagers, carried itself. People began to monitor one another without realizing it, a network of fear and devotion she had engineered without ever raising suspicion. Every glance, every whispered comment, every hesitant prayer became part of her silent web. She studied patterns in human behavior like a mathematician. Fear followed logic. Obedience was predictable. Guilt was a resource to be harvested. And she collected all three with relentless precision. To a casual observer, she was merely a healer, gentle, attentive, devout. But in her house, beneath the floorboards, and within the hidden manuscripts she secretly maintained, she was building a blueprint for absolute control. Her rituals, carefully disguised as medical procedures or acts of piety, were exercises in human conditioning. A minor illness became a lesson in trust, a small injury a test of courage. And when the villagers survived these tests, their loyalty deepened. They did not see themselves as subjects. They saw themselves as faithful members of the community, grateful for the mercy of a skilled woman who moved among them like an angel of God. And yet, Prudence was more than an experimenter. She was an artist of fear. She understood that terror must be precise to be effective. Random violence leaves confusion, but purpose creates obedience. Each murder, each disappearance, each symbolic mark carved into flesh or etched into floorboards was a message that only the initiated could interpret. Said, "I see you. I measure you. I am the unseen hand that defines your limits." It was during this period that Prudence began teaching others, subtly, almost imperceptibly. She offered guidance on herbal remedies, childbirth, and spiritual guidance, all of which carried hidden lessons in submission and trust. Those who followed her instructions became extensions of her influence, unwittingly reinforcing the network of control she had established. She was teaching the village to obey itself under the illusion of free will. By now, the Puritan elders had begun to notice anomalies: missing neighbors, unexplained illnesses, faint whispers in the night. But the more they looked, the more elusive the truth became. Prudence had learned to hide in plain sight, to weave chaos into order, and to make the very structure of belief and morality work for her. Halfway through this story, if you understand the weight of obedience and secrecy, write in the comments, "I see the hidden hand." Write it twice. This locks your awareness into the truths most are too blind to confront. By late summer, Prudence Fairweather had transformed Salem Village into a laboratory not of medicine, but of human submission. The villagers did not realize they were under observation. They did not realize that every fear, every loyalty, every prayer was being cataloged, studied, and used to refine her control. Her influence was now woven into the very culture of the community. Obedience became instinctive, devotion unquestioned, and the line between mercy and manipulation disappeared entirely. Prudence's mastery was subtle. She never coerced. She guided. She never threatened. She suggested. She understood that power achieved through force is fleeting. True power, the kind that endures across generations, is invisible, internalized by those who believe it is freely given. And the villagers, still haunted by the echoes of witch trials, were fertile ground for such manipulation. Fear was already a language they spoke fluently. She merely provided the syntax. Her rituals of murder, meticulously concealed, became both art and instrument. Each victim's placement, each incision, each symbol carved into the flesh was calculated to maximize psychological impact both on the dead and the living. She understood the human psyche like no one in the colony could. She knew that terror must be precise, that belief must be pliable, and that loyalty could be engineered in layers, often without the subject realizing they were bound. The children, too, were not spared. They watched, learned, and absorbed patterns of obedience, fear, and ritual. Prudence's teachings extended beyond medicine. They were lessons in hierarchy's intersection with morality, and in the architecture of power itself. Every birth she oversaw, every illness she cured, became a case study in control. Every family that left her house carried her lessons unknowingly into the wider village. By now, suspicion had surfaced, but it was too fragmented to matter. Elders whispered in fear, neighbors glared with uncertainty, and yet Prudence moved among them unchallenged. Her facade of devout piety, combined with her undeniable skill, made her immune to accusation. And behind that facade, her private work continued, cataloged in journals, etched into bone, and preserved in secret spaces beneath the house. The terrifying truth is this: Prudence Fairweather was not constrained by morality or law. She was constrained only by her curiosity, her precision, and the structure of the human mind. And in that constraint, she discovered something most people never understand: that obedience, fear, and devotion can be engineered, perfected, and transmitted like a disease. Prudence Fairweather's power did not rely on superstition alone. It relied on calculation, She understood the subtleties of human behavior better than the village magistrates understood law, and better than the ministers understood faith. Each interaction was an experiment, each word carefully measured. Every glance, every pause, every gesture became data for her ongoing study of obedience and submission. She understood that control is not won through force. It is won through expectation. People obey when they believe it is their own choice, when they internalize the rules you set without ever realizing it. She shaped the moral and psychological landscape of Salem Village like a sculptor shaping clay. By the time fear was evident, it had already been fully integrated into the villagers' thinking. They had become both observers and subjects of her grand experiment. Her murders were more than acts of violence. They were rituals of demonstration. Each body, bound and marked, conveyed a lesson that could ripple through the village without a single word spoken. Families who noticed a disappearance instinctively adjusted their behavior. Children learned to obey without question. Husbands and wives internalized the unspoken rules of survival, fearing the invisible hand that Prudence had made tangible through absence and silence. And yet, she maintained the guise of piety. Her hands were steady, her voice calm, her prayers fluent. She gave comfort to the suffering, wisdom to the worried, and guidance to the lost. This duality, healer and manipulator, angel and predator, was what made her untouchable. The villagers could not reconcile the good they experienced with the horror beneath the floorboards. They preferred faith to inquiry, devotion to understanding, comfort to truth. Prudence's genius, however, was in the invisible structures she created. The village became self-regulating, enforcing the very behaviors she sought without conscious awareness. Obedience was no longer a rule. It had become instinct. Fear was no longer a threat. It had become law. And the authority she wielded, unrecognized by the masses, was absolute. What few could see, even now, is that Prudence Fairweather's influence did not die with her. The mechanisms she perfected, the subtle shaping of belief, the engineering of compliance, the manipulation of trust through invisible networks, are echoed in every system that seeks to control behavior under the guise of care. She was not merely a murderer. She was a blueprint. By autumn, Prudence Fairweather's dominion over Salem Village was nearly complete, though no one realized the extent. She moved among them like a shadow wearing the skin of civility, guiding, teaching, and observing with unrelenting precision. Every whispered confession, every desperate plea for help, every act of devotion fed her understanding of obedience, morality, and fear. She had become both invisible and omnipresent, a force shaping the minds of all who crossed her path. The disappearances had become methodical. Each victim was chosen not only for physical or social characteristics, but for the psychological value they offered. Some taught obedience through fear, others revealed the cracks in trust, and a few were preserved as lessons for those still alive. The precision of her killings, the ritualistic markings, and the deliberate arrangements of each body were more than murder. They were communication, a secret language written in flesh that only she could read and only she could interpret. Prudence understood that terror must be selective to be effective. Random brutality is chaos. Measured cruelty is doctrine. Each act sent a message to the living. Obedience is invisible, omnipresent, and inevitable. And as the villagers internalized these lessons, she witnessed the transformation firsthand. Fathers adjusted behavior toward children. Mothers monitored neighbors. Friends whispered in fear, replicating the patterns she had established without knowing they were instruments in her experiment. Her medical practice, once the key to gaining trust, had evolved into a tool of authority. Every treatment, every herb administered, every minor surgical intervention was an opportunity to observe limits, reactions, and compliance. Patients left her home not just healed, they were subtly reshaped, mentally and spiritually. Fear had become invisible, obedience automatic, and loyalty a consequence of the structures she had built, not of conscious choice. Yet even as she perfected her system, Prudence maintained the facade of divinity. Devout, pious, and endlessly calm, she presented herself as a moral compass in a fractured community. The villagers, still haunted by the memories of witch trials and the uncertainty of survival, clung to her guidance. And in their dependence, she held absolute, unchallenged power. This is the lesson buried beneath history's surface. True control is rarely enforced. It is cultivated, internalized, and accepted as natural. Prudence Fairweather was not just a killer. She was an architect of obedience, of fear, and of human malleability. And her work endures, echoed in every hidden system designed to shape thought without the governed ever realizing they are governed. Prudence Fairweather's greatest tool was not her knife, her instruments, or even her knowledge of herbs. It was her understanding of perception, the human mind's vulnerability to suggestion, authority, and the illusion of safety. She knew that control is most absolute when it feels voluntary. When the observer believes they are free, they become complicit in their own submission. And Salem Village, still trembling from the witch trials, was the perfect canvas for her work. By now, the rituals had become almost invisible. Villagers spoke of missing neighbors in hushed tones, but refused to question the healer who had tended them so carefully. Fear had been internalized, obedience normalized, and dependence on Prudence complete. Even suspicion had been structured into her design. Whispered doubts and private concerns only reinforced the rules she had imposed. They became self-policing under her invisible hand, unknowingly obeying the framework she had built. Her home had become a crucible. Every tool, every preserved organ, every symbol burned into wood or etched into flesh served as both record and reminder. She cataloged the effects of terror, the malleability of loyalty, and the psychological elasticity of faith. She studied grief, guilt, hope, and despair, mapping the patterns with precision no one else could comprehend. Each night, she reflected on the lessons of the day, adjusting her methods for the next encounter, the next patient, the next disappearance. Prudence's brilliance lay in subtlety. A gentle word, a carefully timed glance, a ritual performed under the guise of healing. These were the instruments she wielded to bend perception. By shaping the reality of those around her, she created an ecosystem of control that required no overt force. The villagers, believing they were acting freely, had become extensions of her influence, carrying her lessons into every household, every interaction, and every prayer. And yet, for all her meticulous control, there remained an undercurrent of danger. A single misstep, an unobserved reaction, or an unexpected challenge could unravel her delicate system. She thrived on this balance, understanding that mastery of human behavior requires both calculation and adaptability. Every day was an experiment, every person a subject, every interaction data. Prudence Fairweather was no ordinary killer. She was a strategist of the human soul. Her lessons were hidden, invisible, and dangerous knowledge that changes a man forever once he realizes how subtly power can be claimed and obedience engineered. By winter's end, the full scope of Prudence Fairweather's design became chillingly clear not just to her, but to anyone who might have dared to glimpse the hidden architecture of her influence. The villagers moved through their lives under invisible strings, unaware they were dancing to her pattern. Her victims, meticulously catalogued and ritualistically placed, served as both warning and lesson. Each disappearance reinforced obedience, shaping the moral and psychological fabric of Salem Village with terrifying precision. Prudence had learned that fear and faith are two sides of the same coin. One cannot dominate without the other. She combined them seamlessly. She healed, she comforted, and she guided all while quietly demonstrating what happens when trust is misplaced, when devotions falter, and when moral boundaries are tested. The villagers internalized these lessons instinctively, carrying them into every aspect of their lives. Obedience had become invisible, instinctual, unchallengeable. Her rituals evolved in complexity. Symbols carved into flesh, markings burned into wood, and the precise arrangement of bodies were not mere superstition. They were experiments in perception and control. Prudence measured reactions not just of individuals but of entire families, entire networks of human behavior. She understood the subtle dynamics of social pressure, guilt, and shame. A whispered confession could ripple outward, affecting decisions, loyalty, and trust throughout the village. Even those closest to her remained unaware. Neighbors, friends, and fellow healers believed themselves autonomous. They were blind participants in a web she had spun with unparalleled skill. Every act of devotion, every prayer, every minor decision was filtered through the architecture of fear and obedience she had carefully designed. The village itself had become a living experiment, a reflection of her understanding of human malleability. And in the quiet moments, when Prudence retreated to her study, she recorded her observations with meticulous care. Notes on anatomy, psychology, ritual, and human compliance filled journals that were later confiscated and buried by authorities too fearful to understand the scope of her work. What she created was not simply a series of murders. It was a blueprint for control, for domination masked as benevolence, for obedience disguised as trust, for terror presented as salvation. The lesson is clear, even centuries later. True power lies not in the act of killing, but in the quiet shaping of minds, the unseen imposition of authority, and the subtle orchestration of human behavior. Prudence Fairweather was more than a serial killer. She was the architect of invisible chains. By the end of her reign, Prudence Fairweather had transcended the role of mere mortal. She had become an unseen force, a ghostly architect of obedience, fear, and faith. Her presence lingered even where her physical form had departed. The villagers did not realize that she had rewritten the very rules of their perception, teaching them to follow her without command, to trust her without question, to fear her system without ever seeing it. Every glance, every word, every act of devotion had been carefully orchestrated to make them instruments of her design. Her killings, meticulously ritualized and precise, were only the surface. Beneath them lay the deeper work, a blueprint of manipulation, a mapping of obedience that transformed an entire community into willing participants in her invisible system. She had discovered the essence of power, to be omnipresent while remaining unseen, to rule through subtle suggestion rather than overt domination, to make the governed complicit in their own subjugation. Even the most devout villagers began unconsciously enforcing her rules among themselves. Suspicion, fear, and faith had fused into a self-sustaining mechanism. Families monitored neighbors. Children internalized expectations they never fully understood. Obedience had become instinct, and yet all of it was invisible, undetectable to those who had not studied the architecture of control as Prudence had. The journals she kept, buried beneath floorboards and hidden in secret compartments, contained not just records of her murders, but detailed studies on psychology, ritual, and human behavior. Observations that centuries later would echo in hidden experiments, secret societies, and the methods used to engineer compliance in systems that govern behavior today. Prudence Fairweather, in her time, was not merely a murderer, she was a pioneer of human manipulation, a scholar of fear, and a master of invisible dominion. And the final truth is unavoidable. Power is rarely seized by force. It is cultivated in silence, exercised through perception, and perfected through subtlety. Prudence Fairweather understood this instinctively. She taught it to a village that thought itself free, shaping obedience in ways they would never consciously recognize. This is the knowledge most are forbidden to see, the lesson buried beneath centuries of sanitized history. And now that you know it, you cannot unlearn it. You have glimpsed the machinery of control, the invisible chains that bind not just communities but minds. Prudence Fairweather's legacy is not measured in the bodies she took, though 17 souls were marked by her hand. It is measured in the architecture of fear she constructed, the invisible chains she wove into the minds of Salem Village, and the lessons she silently taught about obedience, perception, and power. She was not merely a killer, she was a strategist of the human psyche, a master of subtle domination, and an architect of systems that endure far beyond her lifetime. By the time the authorities attempted to investigate, the damage was already done. The village had internalized her rules. Families policed themselves. Children anticipated her expectations. Fear, devotion, and obedience had fused into a seamless network that required no reinforcement. And even though her house was eventually abandoned and the evidence buried, the imprint of her methods remained a ghostly influence embedded in the structure of the community itself. Prudence's brilliance was in her understanding of invisibility. True power, she proved, does not demand attention. It requires patience, precision, and the subtle orchestration of belief. The tools she left behind, her instruments, her rituals, her journals, were not merely instruments of death. They were blueprints, lessons for anyone who could perceive them, instructions on how to bend reality without ever being seen. And this is the part history tries to erase. Systems of control are engineered. Fear is not always obvious. Obedience can be manufactured. Devotion can be guided. Prudence Fairweather's work reminds us that human behavior can be mapped, predicted, and influenced by a mind disciplined enough to study the patterns, clever enough to conceal the mechanism, and ruthless enough to act without moral restraint. You have now walked through the shadows she cast, the hidden corridors of her design, and the invisible networks she built. This knowledge is dangerous. It is intoxicating, and it cannot be ignored, because once you see how deeply influence can infiltrate a mind, a family, a village, a system, you begin to perceive the hidden hands operating in your own life. Remember this: the chains of obedience are rarely visible. They are crafted silently, applied subtly, and maintained by those too afraid or too trusting to question. Prudence Fairweather understood this instinctively. And now, so do you. Comment, "I see the hidden hand," twice if you're ready to uncover the truths history tried to bury. Share this with someone who wants to see what others are too blind to notice. Are you ready to confront the unseen forces shaping our world?